I never liked camping alone, but I wanted to prove to myself that I could do it. I had always camped with friends, always had that safety net of knowing someone was close by, but this time was different. I wanted to be alone with my thoughts, away from everything. Just me, the trees, the quiet. I picked a remote spot deep in the national forest, far from the main trails. It was a place I had read about in a forum. No designated campsites, no amenities, just raw, undisturbed wilderness. The kind of place that real campers seek out. The drive-in was long, over miles of uneven dirt roads, bouncing my truck enough to make me regret not checking my suspension before coming out here. I passed no other vehicles, no signs of people. That was what I wanted. By the time I found a decent clearing and set up my tent, the sun was already dipping behind the trees. The air turned cooler, thick with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. The only sounds were the occasional rustling of branches in the wind and the distant call of some bird I couldn't name. I built a small fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat in the growing darkness, staring into the flames. It was peaceful in a way that city life never was. No car horns, no voices, no artificial hum of streetlights or distant traffic. Just the fire crackling and the distant, almost imperceptible movements of the forest. I should have felt at ease, but something was off. I didn't notice it at first. It wasn't a sound or a smell, not anything obvious. It was a feeling, an unease that crept in as the last traces of daylight faded. A sensation that made my skin prickle. I tried to brush it off. First nights camping alone were always unsettling. I had read that in forums. The mind plays tricks. The darkness becomes a canvas for imagined dangers. I told myself that was all it was. I made sure my truck was locked, secured my food in a tree away from my tent, then crawled into my sleeping bag, forcing myself to relax. But the feeling didn't leave. It got worse. Lying there, listening to the silence, I realized what was wrong. It was too quiet. The forest was alive when I arrived. Chirping insects, distant bird calls, the occasional rustling of something moving through the underbrush. But now nothing. No wind, no animals, just a hollow silence pressing down on me. That wasn't normal. Something had changed. Something was out there. I strained to listen for any sound, anything at all, but the silence was absolute. I tried to slow my breathing, calm my racing heart. There was no reason to panic. Probably just a predator nearby, a fox, maybe a coyote, and the smaller animals had gone still. I closed my eyes, forcing myself to sleep. At some point, I must have dozed off. Then I woke up. I don't know what time it was. The fire had burned down to embers, barely giving off any light. My tent was completely zipped, but I could hear something outside. A soft, deliberate movement. Not the chaotic rustling of an animal scavenging. Not the sharp, quick steps of a deer. Something slower, heavier, human. I went still, every muscle in my body tensed. I held my breath, listening. The sound came again, closer this time. A faint crunch of leaves. A careful, measured step. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Who else would be out here? I had driven miles down that empty dirt road. There were no campsites nearby, no trails leading to my spot. No reason for anyone to be here, but someone was. I stayed frozen, gripping my pocket knife inside my sleeping bag, barely even breathing. My truck was locked. My food was hanging in a tree. There was nothing to attract an animal. This wasn't some lost hiker stumbling upon my camp by accident. This was intentional. The footsteps circled my tent. Slow, unhurried, listening. Then they stopped, right outside. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, every part of me screaming to move, to do something, but I couldn't. I was trapped in my own fear. Then a faint sound. Not a voice, not a cough, just the quiet, deliberate sound of someone breathing. They were standing inches from my tent, just standing there, listening, breathing. I stayed motionless, waiting for them to speak, to move, to do anything. But they didn't. They just stood there. Seconds stretched into minutes. My muscles ached from staying still. My mind raced through every possible scenario. Should I unzip the tent, jump out, try to scare them off? Should I wait? Should I run? Then another sound. Footsteps moving away. Not fast, not hurried. Just the same slow, deliberate steps, fading into the distance. I waited, straining to hear more, but there was nothing, just silence. I stayed like that for hours, knife clutched in my hand, waiting for them to come back. They never did. At first light, I forced myself out of the tent. The forest looked normal, untouched. The fire pit, my food, my gear. Everything was exactly where I left it.
No footprints.
No sign that anyone had been there. But I knew what I heard. I packed up fast, barely even eating. I didn't feel safe until I was back in my truck, speeding down that dirt road, getting as far from that place as possible. I don't know who was out there that night. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing. They weren't lost. They weren't camping. They had no reason to be there. And they were watching me. I never camp alone anymore. I decided to go camping alone. I had done it before plenty of times, but this trip was different. I wasn't sticking to the usual campgrounds. I wanted real solitude, somewhere deep in the woods where I wouldn't see another person for miles. That was the whole point. I picked a spot in a national forest, far off any marked trails. I had studied the maps, checked the terrain, and made sure I had everything I needed. Plenty of food, a good tent, extra layers, a sharp knife, and my rifle. Not that I expected to need the rifle, but when you're out in the middle of nowhere, it's better to have it. The drive out was long. First, it was pavement, then a winding gravel road, and finally a narrow dirt trail barely wide enough for my truck. By the time I reached a good place to park, I was already deep into the forest. The trees pressed in on all sides, thick and dark, the kind of place where cell service didn't exist. I grabbed my pack, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and hiked in. It was about an hour to the clearing I had chosen. No signs of recent campers, no trash, no fire pits, no footprints. Just untouched wilderness. Exactly what I wanted. I set up my tent near a small stream, got my fire going, and settled in. As the sun lowered, the woods filled with sound. Birds calling, insects buzzing, the occasional rustle of something moving through the undergrowth. Felt alive, and that was comforting. But as night fell, the noises changed. The usual sounds faded. No more birds, no more insects, just the whisper of the wind in the trees. I noticed it, but I told myself it was nothing. Probably just the temperature dropping. Maybe a predator nearby, a fox, maybe even a cougar, making everything else go still. I had my rifle. I wasn't worried. I ate my meal, sat by the fire, and listened to the quiet. The silence stretched on longer than it should have. That's when the unease started. I shook it off and turned in for the night. Sometime later, I woke up. I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep. I lay still, listening. The fire outside had burned down to embers, giving off just enough light to faintly glow through the walls of my tent. Then I heard it, a branch snapping, not close but not far, somewhere in the trees. I waited, barely breathing. Nothing, just the sound of my own heartbeat. Then another snap, closer this time. This wasn't some small animal moving through the underbrush. The steps were careful, deliberate, human. I reached for my rifle, sliding it close. My hand was steady, but my pulse was racing. Who the hell would be out here? There were no trails.
No campgrounds.
No reason for anyone to be this far off the grid. I stayed still, listening. The footsteps stopped. Silence. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I lay there, heart hammering, waiting. 5 minutes passed, maybe 10. Nothing. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe a deer. Maybe my mind playing tricks on me. I forced myself to close my eyes. And then a sound. Breathing. Soft. Slow. Just outside my tent. I froze. Every muscle in my body went rigid. This wasn't my imagination. This wasn't an animal. Someone was standing inches from my tent, listening. I gripped my rifle tight, ready to rip open the tent and confront whoever was there. But I hesitated. What if they had a gun? What if they were waiting for me to make the first move? I held my breath, waiting. The breathing continued, steady and calm. Then slowly it faded. Footsteps moving away, back into the trees. Slow, measured, like they weren't in a hurry, like they wanted me to know they were leaving. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I lay there, rifle in hand, waiting for them to come back. They didn't. At first light, I got out of my tent, rifle raised, scanning the tree line. The forest was still, quiet. I walked the perimeter of my campsite.
No footprints.
No broken branches. No sign that anyone had been there. But I knew what I had heard. I packed up fast. No breakfast, no fire. Just stuffing my gear into my pack as quickly as I could. I wasn't sticking around. The hike back to my truck felt longer. Every step, I expected to hear those footsteps again. Every shadow between the trees looked like someone watching. I reached my truck, threw my gear in, and got in fast, locking the doors out of instinct. The engine roared to life, breaking the silence. I turned onto the dirt road, speeding down it faster than I should have, heart pounding, eyes scanning the mirrors. No one followed. I made it back to civilization without looking back. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I do know one thing. They weren't lost. They weren't camping. They had no reason to be there. And they were watching me. I haven't been camping alone since. I was never the kind of person who took risks. I liked things planned, controlled, predictable. That's why I hesitated when my brother, Jake, invited me on a camping trip deep in the mountains. He had always been the adventurous one, the kind of guy who loved pushing himself, testing his limits. I was the opposite, but I hadn't seen him in months, and he made it sound like an easy trip. 2 nights, nothing extreme, just a chance to catch up and unwind. I agreed even though I had a bad feeling about it. We left early in the morning, his truck packed with gear. The drive took hours, winding through narrow roads, climbing higher into the mountains. The farther we went, the fewer people we saw. Towns turned into clusters of cabins, then just trees and empty road. By the time we reached the trailhead, we hadn't seen another car for over an hour. We parked, grabbed our packs, and started the hike. The air was crisp, clean, the kind of air that made you feel small in the best way. The trees were massive, stretching high, their thick branches blocking most of the sunlight. The trail was rough, barely used, just dirt and scattered rocks cutting through the dense forest. Jake led the way, moving fast, always a few steps ahead. I struggled to keep up, my legs burning as we climbed higher. We followed the trail for miles, cutting off at a small clearing near a river. It was the perfect spot. Flat ground, plenty of space, water nearby. It looked untouched, like no one had been there in years. We set up camp fast, pitching our tents, gathering firewood. Jake built the fire while I laid out our food. We ate as the sun set, the sky fading from orange to deep blue. The forest was quiet, peaceful. No distant sounds of cars, no voices, just the wind moving through the trees and the faint rush of the river. Felt good, better than I expected. I fell asleep fast, exhaustion from the hike pulling me under. I woke up sometime in the night. At first, I didn't know why. My body felt heavy, my mind foggy with sleep. Then I heard it, movement outside my tent. Slow, deliberate steps, crunching softly in the dirt. I told myself it was Jake, maybe up for a piss or checking the fire, but something about the way the footsteps moved didn't feel right. Too slow, too careful. I held my breath, listening. The steps circled the tent once, then again. I wanted to call out, to ask if it was him, but something stopped me. The footsteps paused. Then they moved away, fading into the trees. I stayed awake for hours, heart pounding, ears straining for any sound. But I heard nothing else. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside, trying to shake the unease from the night before. The fire was still smoldering. Jake's tent zipped shut. I looked around, checking the dirt for tracks, and I saw them. Footprints. Not boots, not hiking shoes, bare feet, large, deep impressions in the dirt, circling my tent, then leading off into the woods. I stared at them, my stomach twisting. They weren't Jake's. They were too big, the toes too spread out, the shape unnatural. I forced myself to look away. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe it was nothing. I didn't mention it to Jake. We spent the day exploring, hiking farther up the mountain, following an old game trail to a ridge with an incredible view. It should have been fun, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Every time we stopped, I found myself listening, scanning the trees. We made it back to camp just before sunset. The fire felt like a comfort, a barrier between us and whatever was out there. That night, I barely slept. I listened. The forest was too quiet. No wind, no distant calls of animals, just silence. Then, sometime in the early morning, I heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they didn't circle the tent. They stopped right outside. I lay frozen, barely breathing. The fabric of the tent shifted, something pressing against it. Not a hand, a face. I could see the outline, the faintest impression of features. Stayed there, inches away, unmoving. Then it was gone. I heard the footsteps retreat into the trees. The sun couldn't come fast enough. When morning finally arrived, I got up, checking the ground. The footprints were there again, closer this time. Jake was already up, messing with the fire, acting normal. He didn't notice anything. I almost told him, but I didn't. We packed up later that day, cutting the trip short. Jake was annoyed, said we had planned for 2 nights, but I didn't care. I needed to leave. The hike back felt longer. Every step, I fought the urge to look over my shoulder. When we finally reached the truck, I felt the tension in my chest ease. We drove back in silence, the trees thinning, the mountains shrinking in the rearview mirror. I didn't say anything, and I never told Jake what I saw. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. I never liked camping alone. There was something about being deep in the woods, miles away from anyone, that made me uneasy. But I had been doing solo camping trips for years, trying to push myself past the fear. And for the most part, I had gotten used to it. This trip was supposed to be easy. 3 nights in the backcountry, deep in a national forest that stretched for miles in every direction. No designated campsites, no trails, just thick, untouched woods. I had planned the route carefully, picked a good spot near a small stream, and packed enough supplies to last me the entire time. The drive out took half the day. I parked my truck at the edge of an old logging road, the last place any vehicle could reach. After that, it was just me and the trees. The hike was tough. The forest was thick, the undergrowth making it hard to move in some places. I had to check my map every half hour to make sure I was still on course. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. No distant sounds of cars or people, just the wind moving through the pines and the occasional rustle of small animals in the brush. By the time I reached the spot I had marked on the map, the sun was getting low. It was perfect. A flat clearing, soft ground covered in pine needles, a small stream nearby. I dropped my pack, stretched out my sore shoulders, and got to work setting up camp. The first night was uneventful. I built a small fire, cooked a quick meal, and sat for a while, listening to the quiet. The air was cool, the smell of pine thick. I should have felt at peace, but I didn't. Something felt wrong. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't anything obvious. The forest just felt too still, like it was holding its breath. I ignored it, chalking it up to my usual nerves. I crawled into my tent, zipped up my sleeping bag, and forced myself to sleep. At some point in the night, I woke up. At first, I didn't know why. Then I heard it, movement outside the tent. Not an animal. Something heavy, slow, careful. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps circled the tent, crunching softly over the pine needles. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to stay still. The footsteps stopped. Then nothing. I lay awake for hours, waiting, listening, but I never heard it again. By morning, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe a deer, curious about the smell of food. I shook off the fear, made breakfast, and spent the day exploring the area. The second night, I stayed up later, keeping the fire going longer than before. The woods were silent, too silent. I barely slept. And then on the third night, it got worse. I woke up again. The fire had burned down to embers. The air was cold, still, and something was outside my tent. Closer this time. I could hear breathing. Slow, deep breaths, just on the other side of the thin fabric. I didn't move, didn't even blink. Something pressed against the tent. A hand, not a paw, not a branch. A hand. It stayed there for a long time. Then, just as slowly, it pulled away. The footsteps moved back into the trees. And then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A whistle, low, drawn out, like someone calling a dog. I didn't sleep after that. I lay there, waiting, heart hammering in my chest. As soon as the sun came up, I packed my things and left. The hike back felt different. I kept checking over my shoulder, scanning the trees. The feeling never went away. Even when I reached my truck, even when I drove away, I felt it. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't want to know. I always camped alone. It wasn't that I didn't have friends or that I didn't enjoy being around people. I just preferred the solitude. Out in the wild, away from the noise of the world, I felt more like myself. No distractions, no pressure, just me and the quiet. This trip was supposed to be like any other. A long weekend deep in the mountains, far from any trails or campgrounds. I had picked the spot carefully, miles from the nearest road, near a small creek, surrounded by thick pines. I wanted complete isolation. I got it, but I wasn't alone. The hike in was harder than I expected. The trail was barely there, more of a game path than anything made for people. The trees grew thick, their roots twisting up from the ground like veins. Every step had to be careful, precise. The air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and pine, the kind of deep forest scent that clings to your skin. I moved fast, wanting to set up camp before dark. I had checked the weather before I left. Clear skies, cool nights, no storms. It was perfect. By late afternoon, I found the spot. A small clearing nestled between towering pines, the ground covered in soft moss. A narrow creek cut through the edge of the clearing, its water dark and slow-moving. The air was still, silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves high above. Too silent. I had camped in places like this before, deep enough into the wild that even birds seemed scarce. But something about this stillness felt unnatural. I ignored it. I set up camp quickly, pitched my tent, gathered firewood, made a small fire. As the sun dipped lower, the woods turned darker, shadows stretching long across the ground. The flames flickered, casting strange shapes on the trees. I ate without much thought, my mind occupied by the stillness. There was no wind, no distant hoots of owls or rustling in the underbrush, just the low crackle of the fire and my own breathing. Felt wrong, like something was waiting, watching. I told myself I was being paranoid, that spending too much time alone out here did things to your mind. I forced myself to focus on the fire, on the warmth, on the normalcy of the routine. The feeling didn't go away. I woke up in the middle of the night. First, I didn't know why. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Careful. Not the quick, nervous steps of a deer or the light scurrying of a raccoon. Something heavier. I lay still, my body stiff, ears straining. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. Barely enough light to see the edges of my tent. Shadows shifted outside. The footsteps circled my camp. I forced myself to breathe slow, quiet. My heart pounded in my chest, the sound of it filling my ears. I had my knife within reach, but I didn't move. The steps stopped. Silence. Then, just as slowly as they came, they faded into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. I lay there listening, waiting. The forest never made a sound. Morning came slow. The air was thick with mist, the trees shrouded in a dull gray light. I stepped outside my tent, my muscles aching from lying stiff all night. I checked the ground. Footprints, large, barefoot, circling my tent, then disappearing into the trees. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. This wasn't an animal. This wasn't some lost hiker. Someone had been out there, watching me. I packed up quickly. The plan had been to stay for 3 nights. I decided to leave before nightfall. I spent the day keeping busy, breaking down my camp slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe I was overreacting. I didn't believe that. I kept my knife close, my axe closer. By late afternoon, my pack was ready. The sun hung low in the sky, turning the mist golden. I took a deep breath, adjusted the straps, and started back toward my truck. I moved fast, too fast. The woods were silent. I checked over my shoulder every few minutes, scanning the trees. I saw nothing, but I felt it, the presence, something following, keeping its distance. I picked up my pace. The feeling didn't fade. It got worse. I wasn't imagining it. I could hear it now. Footsteps.
Matking mine.
Stopping when I stopped. Keeping just out of sight. I gripped my knife tighter, my palms slick with sweat. The truck was still miles away. I forced myself to keep moving, steady, controlled. If I ran, I knew it would chase me. I walked for hours, every step heavier, my legs burning. The forest stretched endless around me, the trees towering, watching. And then, finally, I saw it, a sliver of road through the trees. My truck. Relief hit me so hard I almost collapsed. I moved faster, closing the distance, my heart racing. The footsteps behind me stopped. The air was still again. I didn't look back. I threw my pack in the truck, started the engine, and sped down the dirt road without stopping. I didn't breathe until I hit pavement. I never went back. I still don't know who was out there, or what they wanted. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I hear footsteps outside my window. I never used to think much about fear. Growing up, my family spent most of our summers camping, hiking, and fishing in the vast forests of the Pacific Northwest. My dad called it building character, but I always thought of it as normal life. The woods were my playground. Their towering trees, the deep underbrush, the quiet streams that wound through the landscape. The nights were filled with the comforting sounds of nature, and the campfire's glow always felt like home. As I got older, the trips became less frequent. College, jobs, relationships. All the usual excuses piled up, and the woods became a distant memory, something I visited only through old photos or the occasional weekend hike. Then last year, Dad passed away. His heart just stopped one night, leaving Mom and me to sift through the fragments of our old life. In the months that followed, I found myself craving solitude. The kind you can only find miles away from people, out where the only company is the wind through the trees. It wasn't just about getting away. It was about reconnecting with the part of me that had been left behind in those forests. So I planned a trip. I chose a remote lake in the middle of a state forest, a place Dad had mentioned once. He had called it perfect, far from any trails, surrounded by dense woods, and untouched by the usual crowds of campers. The idea of sitting by that lake, under the same stars Dad and I had once shared, felt right. I spent weeks preparing, studying maps, gathering supplies, double-checking everything. The plan was simple. For days alone in the woods, just me and the memories of those summers. The drive took hours, the last stretch on an old logging road that wound through the forest like a snake. My truck bounced over potholes and rocks, the trees pressing in on both sides. When I finally parked, the silence was deafening. No hum of distant highways, no chatter of people, just the heavy stillness of the wilderness. I slung my pack over my shoulder, locked the truck, and started the hike. The trail was barely a suggestion, a faint line in the underbrush marked by broken branches and patches of flattened grass. The forest was thick, the canopy blocking most of the sunlight, turning the world into a realm of green shadows and filtered light. The air was cool and damp, heavy with the smell of moss and wet earth. Every step felt like shedding a layer of the life I had left behind. The noise, the stress, the grief, all of it faded with each mile. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was dipping low, turning the water into a sheet of molten gold. It was exactly as Dad had described. A small, clear lake, its surface like glass, reflecting the towering pines that lined its shore. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the air was rich with the scent of cedar. I set up my tent near the water, gathered firewood, and built a small fire as the last light faded from the sky. I sat by the fire, listening to the gentle lap of water against the shore. Stars appeared one by one, until the sky was a tapestry of light, stretching from horizon to horizon. I thought of Dad, of those summers, of how small and distant the world felt out here. As the fire died down, the forest settled into a deep, unbroken silence. I crawled into my tent, pulled my sleeping bag around me, and let the steady rhythm of the lake lull me to sleep. I woke up to the sound of something moving outside my tent. At first, I thought it was a dream, the kind where your mind pulls in the sounds around you and turns them into strange, nonsensical narratives. But as I lay there, the fog of sleep slowly lifting, I realized it was real. The sound was faint, almost indistinct, a soft rustling in the leaves, the careful crunch of footsteps. Not the quick, erratic movements of an animal, but something heavier, deliberate. I held my breath, listening, every muscle tensed. The fire had long since died, leaving the world outside pitch black. The footsteps circled the tent once, then stopped. I waited, heart pounding, ears straining for any hint of sound. Minutes passed, stretching into what felt like hours, but the forest was silent again. Slowly, the tension ebbed, and exhaustion pulled me back into sleep. Morning came with the soft light of dawn, filtering through the fabric of the tent. I crawled out, stiff and sore, my mind still thick with the remnants of the night. The fire was cold, a small mound of ash and half-burnt wood. I scanned the ground, searching for tracks, for anything that might explain the sounds. There were footprints, bare feet, pressed into the soft earth, circling the tent before leading off into the trees. I stared at them, my stomach twisting into knots. The prints were large, the toes spread wide, like someone had been walking barefoot through the woods. They were too big for a child, too careless for a hiker. I told myself it was nothing, Maybe another camper, someone curious but harmless. The lake was remote, but not impossible to reach. Still, the sight of those prints haunted me as I went through the motions of breakfast and planning my day. I decided to stay close to camp. The thought of wandering too far, of losing sight of the tent, made my skin crawl. Instead, I spent the day fishing in the lake, the rhythmic casting and reeling a welcome distraction. The woods remained eerily quiet. No birds, no distant rustle of animals. Just the occasional splash of a fish and the whisper of the breeze. By late afternoon, the unease had settled into a dull ache at the back of my mind. I built the fire high that night, feeding it until the flames roared, casting long, flickering shadows into the trees. As darkness fell, the stillness returned, wrapping around the camp like a shroud. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, my back to the water. The stars blinked into existence, their light cold and distant. When I finally crawled into the tent, the fire was still burning, a small comfort against the unknown. But sleep did not come easy. Every rustle of leaves, every shift of the fire's light sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. Hours passed, each minute marked by the relentless beating of my heart. Then, just as my body began to surrender to sleep, I heard it again. Footsteps, slow, heavy, moving around the camp. They stopped at the edge of the fire's light, a dark silhouette just beyond the glow. I strained my eyes, trying to make out the shape, the details, but it was too dark. And then, as if sensing my gaze, it moved away, disappearing into the trees.